I didn't realize my son only contacted me when he needed help, until the day I stopped offering it first. For most of my life, I believe the small things parents do for their children simply continue forever. You help them with homework when they're young. You fix their broken bicycles. You pick them up from school when it rains. Later, the problems grow bigger: college applications, job worries, broken relationships, but the instinct remains the same. You help. That's what being a parent feels like. And when you've spent 30 or 40 years doing it, you stop noticing the difference between helping because your child needs you, and helping because that's the only time they reach out. My son Daniel was born on a cold January morning. I still remember the quiet of the hospital hallway when the nurse first handed him to me. The world outside the window was gray and frozen, but in that room everything felt warm and strangely peaceful. He was smaller than I expected. His fingers curled around mine with a grip that seemed impossibly strong for someone so tiny. I remember thinking that this was the beginning of something that would last the rest of my life. And in many ways it did. When Daniel was young, our house never stayed quiet for long. He had a way of moving through rooms like a sudden gust of wind, always running, always asking questions, always dragging something new into the living room that he had discovered outside. Sometimes it was a frog from the backyard. Sometimes it was a handful of rocks he believed were fossils. Sometimes it was a broken toy he wanted me to fix. "Dad," he would say, holding the pieces together in both hands, "can you make it work again?" And most of the time, I could. When you're raising a child, you spend years convincing them that you know how to solve almost any problem. Looking back now, I realize how powerful that belief must have felt to him. Every Saturday morning when Daniel was growing up, we had a routine. We went to the same small hardware store a few blocks away. The place smelled like sawdust and machine oil. Old wooden shelves held rows of tools, nails, and paint cans that seemed to stretch forever. Daniel loved that store. He followed me through the aisles like an explorer discovering a new world. Sometimes he carried a small basket and insisted on helping choose things. Once, when he was about 8 years old, he picked out a small hammer with a bright red handle. "Why do you need that?" I asked him. "For building things." "What kind of things?" He thought about that for a moment, then shrugged. "I don't know yet." That was Daniel when he was young, full of plans he hadn't quite figured out yet. When we came home from those trips, we usually ended up in the garage. Sometimes we fixed things around the house. Sometimes we tried to build things that didn't turn out the way we expected. There was one summer when we tried to build a tree house together. The design was ambitious for two people who had never built one before. The boards didn't always line up. The ladder leaned a little more to the left than it probably should have. But Daniel was proud of it. He spent hours up there reading comic books and pretending it was some kind of lookout tower. One evening he climbed down and sat beside me in the grass. "Dad," he said, "do you think I'll build better things when I'm older?" "Of course you will." "How do you know?" "Because that's what growing up is," I told him. "You keep building things, and eventually you get better at it." He nodded seriously, as if I had just explained something very important. The years moved quickly after that. Daniel grew taller. His voice changed. The garage became less interesting than his friends, his school, and eventually the small part-time jobs he took during high school. But even then, we still had moments together. Sometimes we watched baseball games in the living room on Sunday afternoons. Sometimes we drove to the lake outside town during the summer. Daniel liked to sit at the edge of the dock with his feet in the water. He didn't talk much during those moments. But he didn't need to. Some silences between a father and son feel comfortable in a way words never could. When Daniel left for college, the house felt strangely quiet for the first time. His bedroom stayed clean longer than usual. The hallway seemed bigger somehow. But the phone rang often during those first years. He called to ask about small things. Advice about classes. Questions about fixing things in his apartment. Sometimes he called just to talk about his day. Those calls meant more to me than he probably realized. Hearing your child's voice from miles away reminds you that the connection between you still exists, even when life pulls them in new directions. After graduation, Daniel found a job in another city. It wasn't too far away. A few hours by car. Close enough for occasional visits, we told ourselves. And at first, those visits happened regularly. He came home for holidays. Sometimes he stopped by for a weekend. We sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee while he talked about work. About coworkers. About the strange feeling of becoming an adult. But slowly, over time, the rhythm began to change. The visits became less frequent. The phone calls shorter. Daniel sounded busier each time we spoke. At first, I didn't think much about it. Life moves quickly when you're young. Careers begin. Relationships form. People build their own lives. That's how it's supposed to happen. Then one evening, a few years later, the phone rang. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I answered immediately. "Hey, Dad," he said. His voice sounded slightly rushed. "Hi, Daniel. How are things?" "Good. Busy." There was a short pause. Then he asked something. "Do you still have that set of tools in the garage?" I smiled. "Of course." "Well, my car's been making this strange noise, and the mechanic says it might be something simple. I was wondering if you could take a look this weekend." "Sure," I said without hesitation. Helping your son fix a car didn't seem unusual. That's exactly the kind of thing fathers are supposed to do. He came over that Saturday morning. We spent a few hours in the driveway looking under the hood. Just like the old days in the garage. For a while, it felt familiar. Comfortable. But when the repair was finished, Daniel checked his watch. "I should probably head back soon," he said. "You just got here," I replied. "I know. Work's been crazy." He thanked me for fixing the car, gave me a quick hug, and drove away. I stood in the driveway watching the empty road for a moment. The whole visit had lasted less than 3 hours. Still, I told myself it was normal. People get busy. Life moves forward. The next call came about a month later. This time it was about something else. A problem with his apartment lease. He wanted my advice. Then another call a few weeks after that. A question about taxes. Then another. A problem with his insurance. Each conversation followed the same pattern. A quick greeting. A short explanation of the problem. My help. Then a polite goodbye. It took me a long time to notice the pattern forming between those moments. But one quiet evening, while sitting alone at the kitchen table, the thought finally appeared in my mind. When was the last time my son called just to talk? I sat there for a long time staring at the silent phone on the table. And for the first time, a small uncomfortable realization began to settle quietly in my chest. Maybe the reason Daniel contacted me so often was because I had always made it easy for him to ask for help. For a while after that evening, I tried to convince myself that the thought had been unfair. Parents have a way of questioning themselves when something feels wrong. You go back through old memories, replaying conversations in your mind, looking for some moment you might have misunderstood. And the truth was, Daniel had never been rude to me. He always sounded respectful. He always thanked me for the help. But there was something about the rhythm of our conversations that had quietly changed over the years. Once you notice a pattern, it's hard to stop seeing it. A few weeks after that realization, the phone rang again. It was late afternoon. I had just come inside from raking leaves in the yard. The maple tree in the front had started dropping them earlier that year, covering the lawn in bright orange and yellow. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I wiped my hands on a towel and answered. "Hey, Dad." "Hi, Daniel." He didn't ask how I was doing. Not right away. Instead, there was a short pause, the kind that usually means someone is thinking about how to start a conversation. Then he said, "I wanted to ask you something." I leaned against the kitchen counter. "What's going on?" "Well, my washing machine stopped working this morning." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "And? I was wondering if you might be able to come by this weekend and take a look at it," For a moment I didn't answer. Not because I was angry. Just because something about the request felt strangely familiar. Almost predictable. I suppose I could, I said after a second. Great, he replied quickly. I really appreciate it. We talked for another minute or two about the problem. He described the noise the machine had been making, and I tried to imagine what might be causing it. Then the conversation ended. Just like the others had. When I placed the phone back on the counter, the kitchen felt unusually quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet I had grown used to over the years. This one carried a small weight with it. That Saturday I drove to Daniel's apartment. He lived in a small complex on the edge of the city. Rows of identical buildings lined the street, each with narrow balconies and parking spaces filled with compact cars. Daniel greeted me at the door with a smile. Hey, Dad. Hi. Inside the apartment, everything looked neat and orderly. A few framed photos hung on the wall. One of them caught my attention immediately. It was an old picture of us standing beside the treehouse we built years ago. Daniel must have noticed me looking at it. You remember that thing? He said with a small laugh. Of course I do. It probably wasn't very safe. It survived long enough, I replied. For a moment we both smiled. Then he led me into the laundry room. The washing machine problem turned out to be something simple. A loose hose connection that had come undone. I fixed it in about 20 minutes. Daniel watched while I worked, handing me tools when I asked for them. Just like when he was younger. For a brief moment, the years seemed to fold in on themselves. But when the repair was finished, the moment disappeared just as quickly. Daniel checked his phone. I've got a meeting online in about half an hour, he said. That's fine. You don't have to rush off or anything, but I should probably get ready. I nodded. We stood in the kitchen for a minute longer, either of us quite sure what to say next. Then he thanked me again. Really, Dad, I appreciate it. You're welcome. He walked me to the door. The same quick hug. The same polite goodbye. The drive home felt longer than usual. Not because of traffic. Just because my mind kept drifting back to the same quiet question. When had these visits turned into errands? That evening I made myself a simple dinner and sat at the kitchen table. The chair across from me remained empty, just as it had most nights for years. I thought about Daniel when he was younger. About the boy who used to sit beside me in the garage, holding a red-handled hammer and asking endless questions about how things worked. Back then he didn't just come to me when something was broken. He came because he wanted to spend time together. Because he wanted to learn things. Because he trusted me. Now the reasons felt narrower. More practical. And somewhere deep down, I wondered if that shift had happened so slowly that neither of us noticed it. The next few months followed the same pattern. A phone call every few weeks. Each one beginning almost exactly the same way. Hey, Dad. Then a short explanation. A problem at work. A question about a repair. Advice about paperwork or finances. I answered each time the way I always had. Calmly. Patiently. Because helping your child becomes second nature after enough years. But one evening, something happened that made me pause. Daniel called again. I was sitting in the living room reading when the phone rang. His name appeared on the screen. I answered. Hi, Dad. Hi, Daniel. There was that same pause again. Then he said it. I need your help with something. The words were simple. But hearing them out loud, exactly the way he said them, suddenly made the pattern impossible to ignore. For the first time, I didn't immediately ask what the problem was. Instead, I asked something else. How have you been? There was silence on the other end of the line. Not long. Just long enough to feel unexpected. Oh, he said after a moment. I've been good. Busy. What have you been working on lately? He hesitated. Then he began talking about a project at work. The conversation drifted into new territory. We spoke for almost 15 minutes before he finally mentioned the thing he had originally called about. A problem with his car registration. Something he needed advice on. I helped him, of course. But after we hung up, I sat quietly in the chair for a long time. Because something about that call had felt different. For the first time in years, the conversation had begun with something other than a problem. It wasn't much. Just a small shift. But it was enough to make me wonder something I hadn't considered before. Maybe Daniel wasn't intentionally calling only when he needed help. Maybe that was simply the role I had always played in his life. The man who fixed things. The man who solved problems. And if that was true, then perhaps the real question wasn't why my son only called when he needed help. Maybe the question was whether I had ever shown him another reason to call at all. That question stayed with me for a long time. Not in a painful way, exactly. Just quietly, the way certain thoughts settle into the background of your mind when you get older. They don't demand attention every minute, but they appear when the house is quiet and the day has slowed down. I thought about Daniel often during those weeks. About the boy he had been. About the man he had become. And about the space between those two versions of him that I hadn't really examined before. Parents like to believe they understand their children completely. After all, we were there at the beginning. We saw the first steps, the first broken toys, the first attempts to understand the world. But somewhere along the way, children grow into people whose lives extend beyond the edges of our understanding. And sometimes that happens so gradually that we don't notice the moment it begins. One evening, about a month after that last phone call, I decided to try something different. Instead of waiting for Daniel to call me, I picked up the phone myself. It felt strangely unfamiliar. For most of my life, I had waited for him to reach out. When the phone rang, I answered. When he asked for help, I gave it. But calling him just to talk, that wasn't something I had done very often. The phone rang 3 times before he answered. Hey, Dad. Hi, Daniel. His voice sounded slightly surprised. What's going on? Oh, nothing in particular, I said. I was just thinking about you. There was a short pause. Then he laughed quietly. That's new. What do you mean? You usually only call when you want to remind me about something. I smiled to myself. Well, today I just wanted to see how you're doing. The conversation that followed was different from the others. Not dramatically different. Just easier. We talked about his week at work. About a restaurant he had discovered near his apartment. About a small trip he was planning with friends. There were no problems to solve. No broken appliances or paperwork questions. Just a simple conversation. When we hung up 20 minutes later, I noticed something that surprised me. The quiet in the house felt lighter. Over the next few weeks, I called Daniel a few more times. Not often. Just occasionally. Sometimes we spoke for a few minutes. Sometimes longer. The conversations slowly became more natural. And something else began to change too. Daniel started calling me again. But now the calls didn't always begin with a request. Sometimes he simply said, Hey, Dad, I had something funny happen at work today. Or, I drove past that old lake we used to visit when I was a kid. Those small moments meant more than I expected. Because they reminded me of something important. Helping your child isn't wrong. It never has been. In fact, for most parents, that instinct never really disappears. Even when your children become adults, part of you still wants to fix things for them. But somewhere along the way, I had allowed that role to become the center of our relationship. Without realizing it, I had become the person Daniel called whenever something in his life stopped working. The mechanic. The advisor. The problem solver. And while there's nothing wrong with those things, they aren't the only reasons a father and son should speak to each other. One afternoon, Daniel came to visit. Not because something was broken. Not because he needed help with anything. Just because he had the day off. When I opened the door and saw him standing there, I felt a small moment of surprise. Hey, Dad. Hey. I was in the area, he said. Thought I'd stop by. Inside the house, We made coffee and sat at the kitchen table. The same table where he used to do homework years ago. The same table where I had spent so many evenings wondering when our conversations had changed. For a while we talked about ordinary things. Then Daniel looked around the kitchen. "You know," he said, "I used to think you always had everything figured out." I laughed softly. "That's because when you're a kid, your parents seem like they know everything. And now I realize most of us are just learning as we go." He nodded slowly. "I guess that's true." For a moment the room grew quiet. Then he said something that stayed with me. "You always helped me when I needed it," he said. "That's what fathers do." "Yeah, but I think I forgot to call when I didn't need anything." The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. But it also made something inside my chest relax. "Life gets busy," I said. "I know." He looked down at the coffee cup in his hands. "I never meant for it to feel like I was only calling when I needed help." "I understand." And the truth was, I did. Because the older you get, the more you realize that most misunderstandings between people aren't caused by cruelty or neglect. They happen quietly. Life moves quickly. Responsibilities pile up. People fall into patterns they never intended to create. And sometimes those patterns continue for years before anyone stops to question them. Daniel stayed for most of the afternoon. We talked about old memories. About the treehouse we built. About the hardware store we used to visit on Saturday mornings. Before he left, we stood in the driveway the way we had so many times before. But this goodbye felt different. Not rushed. Not hurried. Just normal. After his car disappeared down the street, I stood there for a moment watching the empty road. The air was warm. The neighborhood quiet. And I realized something I probably should have understood long ago. My son hadn't been calling only when he needed help because he didn't care about me. He had been calling that way because, for most of his life, that was the role I had always played. The man who fixed things. The one who knew how to solve problems. But once we began talking again without those problems in the middle of the conversation, something changed. Not dramatically. Just enough. Enough to remind both of us that a relationship between a father and son isn't built only on the things that need fixing. Sometimes it's built on something much simpler. A phone call. A memory. Or the quiet understanding that even as life changes, the connection between two people can still find its way back to something familiar.